executing during a given clock cycle. And recall that if we can't figure out a way to deal with that hazard, that it reduces the performance. Recall that the cycle per instruction in a pipeline is the ideal cycle per instruction, which is 1, then plus the stall cycles per instruction. So as soon as you start introducing stall cycles, it affects the performance. And recall there were 3 classes of hazards: structural, data, and control hazards. Structural hazards were where there wasn't enough hardware. It was incompatible simultaneous use of hardware. All right? Data hazards, things like data conflicts, where, for example, one instruction depends on the result of some earlier in-flight instruction. And then finally, and we haven't really looked at this yet, control hazards. And these are caused by branches and jumps and so forth. Really anything that alters the sequential flow of control in a program. All right, good. So how do you deal with structural hazards? Throw more hardware at it. Right? And we saw these examples. Split cycle dual port registers. We saw the split cache, the so-called Harvard architecture, perhaps multiple arithmetic logic units, and whatnot. All right? The principal mechanism for avoiding data conflicts we've seen so far, the principal approach was forwarding. Today we'll try to address instruction reordering. The technical term is rescheduling. If we can reschedule the flow of control in the assembly language code without impacting the outcome, then we could circumvent some data hazards. All right? And then control hazards. Okay? And the idea here is we don't have the branch target address, or we don't have the condition that we need at the time we need it. All right? And it turns out, we'll see later, the primary approaches in the case of branches are early completion logic. We'll see that hopefully today. And then we can look at the particular policies that we employ, be it a flush, a predict not taken, and then the final approach, and hopefully we'll get to this today, is called a branch delay slot. All right, so hopefully we'll see some of these techniques for hazard mitigation today. All right, so here is our first pipeline MIPS data path. We've been looking at this really since more or less the beginning of the term. Okay? It turns out that this introduces a control hazard issue. We'll fix it later, but you at least need to know about it right now. Here's the problem. Okay? When do I know about the branch condition and the branch target address? When is it actually known?
DX.
At the end of execute. Right? Because during execute with this late branch completion, as it's called, here we evaluated the condition and stored it in xm.cnd, and here we calculated the BTA as being NPC plus 4 times the offset. Okay? We added those together, and so therefore, what's the earliest opportunity to fetch the next instruction after the branch?
After the x/m towards the left.
After the branch, when the branch enters the write back stage. Okay? So as soon as you get a branch in the decode stage, decode, execute, memory, write back. That's depending on how you want to count. 3 or 4 clock cycles where you don't know what to do.
Dr. Morris, can I ask something really quick?
Yes.
Now, when we go into forwarding, I'm under the impression that once it gets to the xm.y point, that I can forward from that point, or do I have to wait to the write back stage?
Well, so if it's being written into Y, what's in Y at this point?
The
branch target address, and what's in the condition at this point?
The next,
whether or not you branch.
Right.
So it's only at the beginning of the branch instructions memory stage. Did I say write back?
Yeah.
I apologize. Memory stage.
Okay.
At the beginning, okay, at the beginning of the branch instructions memory stage, we can update the program counter, and therefore, when the branch instruction enters the write-back stage, only then can we fetch the next instruction.
Right.
So we can't even update the PC until the branch instruction enters the memory cycle. Okay? So it takes a clock cycle to evaluate the condition and to update the PC, and therefore the earliest opportunity to fetch the next instruction is when the branch is sitting in the write-back stage.
Okay.
All right? So we need to know that. All right? Here's the bottom line. You can't fetch the correct next instruction until the branch enters the write-back stage. And the reason, again, is simple. When do we know what the next PC will be?
At why?
At the beginning of the memory stage
Okay.
for the branch instruction. Oh, now I know what the program counter is, okay, and whether or not to update it. So I take all of this, update the program counter, then on the next clock cycle, I can then fetch. Why can't I do it at the beginning? Because I don't know what the branch target address is. Whether it's going to be BTA or NPC, I don't know yet. Because I haven't updated PC yet. All right? Good. So, structural hazards, I'm just going to buzz through these. We've already looked at these. Remember the single port register. Remember this probably, if we didn't have dual port registers, you would have taken one clock to fetch this RS, the next clock to fetch RT from the registers. So we eliminated the structural hazard by having, instead of a single port register, what did we have?
A dual.
We had dual port registers. Fetch 2 operands at 1 clock. Okay? And there was the mitigation. All right? So that was an example of a structural hazard that we cured by having a dual port. How do you solve most structural hazards when there's not enough hardware?
The more hardware?
You throw more hardware at it. There's not enough shovels. Well, buy more shovels. Okay? Good. All right, so moving on then. Oops. Good. If it were a single cycle register, then we couldn't overlap decode and write back, because both decode and write back referenced the general purpose register bank. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
And so that would have been the problem here. I can't go into decode here because he is doing his write back. I can't go into it here because he's doing his write back, and so on and so forth. And how did we solve that? By using a split cycle register. Remember, okay, we read in the second half, okay, and we wrote in the first half. Okay, and that allowed us to do 3 different things. 1 write and 2 reads in a single clock cycle. So those were structural hazards that we cured by adding more hardware. All right? We had a similar problem with memory. If we had had a single cache, both instruction cache and data cache in a so-called combined cache, okay, we couldn't have done a fetch and a memory at the same time. And the solution that is used was sometimes called a Harvard architecture, where you have independent instruction and data caches. All right, and this is, again, should be a review. All right, data hazards. Remember this? The problem here was we didn't have forwarding. For example, what is the DAD instruction waiting for?
R3.
He's waiting for both R2 and R3, right? When is the earliest, when does R3 get written? Look, R3 gets written, you see here, during his write-back stage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, on the next clock cycle, he can finally he writes during the first half clock,
But they can read.
and therefore he can read in the second half clock, and therefore in the next clock cycle he can do the decode.
But Dr. Morris,
Yes.
how can he fetch the information that he needs if load still has it?
The load doesn't have it in the first half of T6.
I'm talking about fetching.
In the first half of T6, no. He can do the fetch, he can try to do the T code, but he can't finish the decode.
Okay.
So he's stuck in D code, waiting on a data, Okay, that constitutes a data hazard. And what he's waiting on is R3
Right.
and R2. So when does R2 get written for the load instruction? When does R3 get written?
T6.
In the first half of clock 6. Therefore, he can read him in the second half of clock 6 because we use that split cycle register, and then finally goes into clock cycle 7 for execute. And you can follow a similar pattern here. When is R4 actually available?
After the write back.
Here. So he writes it back in the first half. Therefore, finally in the second half, he can do the fetch.
Okay, I
the
see.
register. The register fetch. So you can see that data hazards without forwarding can introduce a significant stall, in this case 3 clock cycles. And how did we solve that? By using data forwarding. Remember, when was the value that will go into R2, into R3, when is it actually available?
In memory.
After the memory cycle. So at the end of memory cycle, where is it? It's in mw.lmd. So I take this mw.lmd and I forward it, in this case, to dx.b, right? dx.b. And you can follow these other forwarding arrows, okay? So the principal mechanism by which data hazards are resolved is
Forwarding.
forwarding, yes, of course, all right? So, sometimes there are data hazards that you can't resolve with forwarding. In particular, if you have a load followed by an adjacent use, it's going to stall. There's no way out of it. So here I do the load. I need R1. When's the earliest R1's available, even with forwarding?
In memory.
Okay,
Second.
mw.lmd, right? But when did he need him? He
Yeah,
needed him in clock cycle 4, but he wasn't available until clock cycle 5. There's no way around that by using forwarding.
When a load followed by ALU,
Any load followed by an immediate use, followed by a subsequent, on the next instruction, use of whatever was being loaded.
Okay. So it could be D sub, anything that has that.
It can be either an ALU immediate, it could be a branch, anything that needs R1.
Okay.
Okay, can't do its thing until after the memory cycle of the producing instruction. Okay, good. Now, even though we can't sometimes fix a problem with forwarding, we can sometimes just change the ordering, provided it doesn't alter the outcome. All right? So, one thing that we, and by the way, when we use this reordering, that's sometimes called rescheduling. Okay? There's both static and dynamic rescheduling. Static scheduling is done by the compiler. Dynamic scheduling is done by the hardware at runtime. All right, we'll investigate, hopefully in this class, both. All right? So the idea is to move the consumer farther away from the producer. If the stuff I'm producing isn't ready yet, then don't consume it right away. Do something else. Right? You know, can't clean up my room. I can't clean up my room, Mom, because Mary's got the vacuum cleaner. Okay, well then, now wash the dishes, fool. Do something else. Don't sit there picking your nose. Do something else. So the idea is to do something else. All right? And again, static or dynamic. All right? So here's a simple static rescheduling example. Here was before. What was the problem? What was the dependency here?
R1.
R1. Okay? Now, do you see that